Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Good Marketing with Stephanie. Lately, there's been a lot of news, so much news from so many different sources to the point that it is hard sometimes to tell fact from fiction. And sometimes it feels like as a whole, we are moving further and further away from this idea of a shared reality. And we're going to dive into that phenomenon today with our guest. So if you've been feeling that way, if you've noticed, hey, how are we finding our source of truth and all the communications and all the information that's out there today, we are going to talk about that and some of the potential solutions for that. So our guest today is going to be Stephanie Devitt. Stephanie is a sociologist, and she is the founder and principal consultant for SDK Strategic Services, which helps clients turn high-stakes challenges into fair, actionable change that communities can trust under scrutiny. SDK's community research, planning, and change management work has helped Minnesota state agencies, local governments, foundations, and healthcare companies understand and address complex challenges in areas of transportation, technology, health, and the environment. And today we're going to talk a little bit more about the role that communications as a function plays in the relationship between organizations, both in the public sector and the private sector and their stakeholders. Why does this role matter? What are the benefits of acting on it, and what are the consequences of ignoring it? And on a macro level, we're going to zoom out and talk about how communications shape and influence society and how digital media is helping or hurting us with some solutions, as I mentioned earlier, for communications professionals, marketing professionals listening to this conversation and thinking to themselves, how do I combat all of the fragmentation out there across channels and across the information environment? So with that said, welcome, fellow Stephanie. I'm so happy to have you on the show today.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. It's fun to meet another Stephanie.
I know it's always the best. I love working with other Stephanies. Right. I would love to just ask you, to start off this conversation, with respect to your work and your areas of expertise. What's one news story that you're watching right now and why?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And thank you for having me here. It's so lovely to be with you. There's so many stories, it's hard to even keep track of them. But I think two that I'm watching kind of low and slow over time is one is just this discussion around the ICE budget and some of the conversations underneath that about how we're allowing agents to record and follow information, some of those contracts, for example, that go out with ICE. The other one is the SAVE Act. I know that looks like it's been put on ice for now, no pun intended. But I think those are some really interesting conversations that get to the heart of what we're talking about today in terms of how do we share information and how do we engage with not just government, but with each other about how we make shared decisions. So it's interesting moment, if you will.
Yes, absolutely. And, on that note, I would love to just share a little bit with our audience about your career origin story. You just mentioned all the great things we're going to be talking about today, but tell us how you got to this point. Tell us how you built this expertise. Where did you start and how did you get to where you are now?
Yeah, well, thank you for that question. I would say my background is a little unique compared to others. So obviously growing up, lived on a farm. I've worked on a meatpacking plant, but then also went to college, really got into sociology and political sociology, this idea of how do we understand and make shared decisions about our politics and about issues that matter to people's lives. But I've always felt that background combined with just kind of the way I learned life on a farm has really given me a unique lens. Started my career, actually did not go into a PhD. I instead wanted to be an on-the-ground practitioner. So I started working for a US senator and had the opportunity to really understand what issues mattered to people on the ground. But then there was a really pivotal moment for me, and I think for the country in some ways. So the senator I was working with ran for re-election. I had the opportunity to travel with him and just broker information, if you will. But that was the first election in US history where the opposing candidate was paying bloggers to influence how the media covered the election. So it was that first taste of new media, non-traditional media influencing the outcome of elections. And after we lost that election, I moved to Minnesota and have been in consulting for 20 years now, with national firms, regional, and then I've had SDK since 2012. So it's been a great journey for me. I think one thing that has been really interesting for me is since 2020, we've pivoted to serving almost exclusively state and local government clients and had the opportunity to do a lot of listening and engaging with communities that could otherwise be left behind in this digital transition, understanding how they get information, how they connect to opportunity. And just having the opportunity to do that listening work with that sociological mindset in this period post-pandemic has been really eye-opening for me in terms of looking at how what you and I might see in a really digitally connected day-to-day world is so different from the lives that other people are experiencing when they can't get online. And that's really kind of become an anchor of the work since then. So really excited to be talking with you because of that.
I can't wait to dive into all of this more with you, just because it's so fascinating, and to have that sociological perspective on this and that role that communications play is just so fascinating. One thing I do just want to point out is that, you know, a lot of the conversations that we have on this podcast are focused on the private sector, right? So if someone's listening to this and saying, okay, well, you know, I work for a company, so how does what's happening on the state or local or federal government level and how they're communicating affect the communications that I'm doing? So I would love to hear your thoughts about how what happens in the public sector translates to the private sector, right? So I think a good example of that is you mentioned that you're in Minnesota, and you also mentioned when I asked you about the news story, everything that's happening with ICE. And, you know, obviously in the last couple of months, we've heard a lot about ICE and Minnesota. And it might be a little bit strange for someone working in the private sector to think about communicating around a crisis situation of that level, right? Or, you know, how does that apply to what I'm doing? How does the way that information circulates online or in real life, how does that apply to what I'm doing when I'm helping my company with selling a product, basically, right? It's like it almost feels like two totally different worlds. So I'm curious what you think about how, or curious your thoughts on how there is a bridge between the public sector communications and the private sector communications, and maybe what the private sector could learn from the public sector or vice versa.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. And I think it's even important to distinguish between the public sector as government who's serving all public versus politicians and political communication, which I think sometimes people equate with government, but is different. So that I would say is item number one. But I think you raise an interesting and fair question. And I was actually racking my mind with this a little bit as I was looking at your comments. From my perspective, if the question is really about the role communications plays and how government connects to stakeholder groups, or how private companies connect to stakeholder groups, I think what we're seeing overall is that there are so many publics that everybody is trying to manage and keep informed at once. And where that tends to come into play more for your business communicators, for example, is areas of issues management and public affairs, and really thinking about how those different topics that set the regulatory tone for how business does business, how they come into information and how they make decisions. And that can get incredibly complex right now because of just the sheer number of different publics and different topics that are moving somewhat in tandem. And I think the more we're getting more bifurcated, more broken down in terms of those different audiences, the harder it could be for businesses to communicate. And I think it's also harder for government to communicate. One thing that has really stood out to me in the time that we've been working with the public sector is how much the public sector is really trying to build its communications capacity. They just don't have the communications resources that you see in the public sector. And yet they're making these consequential long-term decisions that have so many impacts on so many people. So really bridging those things becomes incredibly important. You know what I mean?
I actually love what you said there. And something that really stood out to me is the point about how there's so many different publics or stakeholder groups that everyone's
Mhm.
trying to manage and keep informed at once. So I think
Mhm.
that is absolutely one of these challenges that we're seeing on the communications front. And as always in, the private sector, being able to speak from that perspective, communications professionals still deal with, the quintessential challenge of sort of having to justify their existence, justify
Mhm.
their being on the payroll and the things that they're advising companies to do. Yet people that are really within that work and within that world see how how fragmented it is at this
Mhm.
time and how many people there
Completely.
are that they have to keep informed. It's not just, oh, well, send out an email. It's not just, oh, send out a press release or do a social post, right? There's so many
Mhm.
different audiences that we're trying to engage. And yes, maybe when you're doing communications for a company, it's not, so it doesn't have such long lasting consequences or effects, right? But it does
Mhm.
affect you. It does affect the company, and it does influence revenue and influences the sustainability of the company and the growth of the company over time. So that's one of the main sort of challenges that we're seeing in the communications world. And then on the other side of it is just all of the misinformation that's out there.
Mm.
I think when we spoke earlier, you referred to it as information pollution, which I loved, and I would love
Yes.
you to dive into that a little bit more. But I think that's the other side of it where maybe we're not seeing this quite as much on the private sector side just yet, but this sort of, I don't know, like background fear, background noise of, what if something comes out about the company that's not true, or about a spokesperson that's not true? What if something comes out that is true? And how are we going to respond to that? So I think it's sort of just that new media landscape that you touched on,
Oh,
and
completely.
how to try to get our arms around it as communications professionals, and how important that is, right, for companies to do
Yeah.
this. So yes, you totally touched on what I want to talk about, and that bridge between the public sector and the private sector, and the importance of communications and that role that communications plays. So to that point, what are the benefits of prioritizing communication, both digital communication and, offline communication, so to speak? And what are the consequences of ignoring communications as a function between organizations and their publics?
That's a fascinating question. And I actually want to come back to something you'd said a minute ago to set that up. Just hearing how you're thinking about this topic, I think one thing that stands out to me is, when I started my career, traditional media was really the monolith that set the narrative for how we think about a lot of our politics and a lot about general issues, right? And so much of the work of communication was about competing for that limited newspaper space, or really trying to frame topics in a different way. We're now moved to almost a completely different landscape. I always use this quote from Eric Schmidt of Google, where I think he said in 20, maybe 15 or something, we're creating as much information every 48 hours as we created from the dawn of time to 2000. So we're moving from this space of competing for a shared narrative and like who's going to influence that, to really kind of an open space where there is no shared narrative. There's multiple shared narratives and this gigantic volume of information that you're trying to communicate and kind of almost compete within. And so I think that's a little bit as well of what you're talking about in terms of just, I see that as the information pollution when we talk about how much there is that's quantity, not quality, right? But still, any communicator, whether you're in the public sector or the private sector, whether you're an individual or a large organization, you really have to articulate a narrative and maintain visibility, maintain connection, maintain trust with those stakeholder groups that matter to your work in that environment. And it becomes all the more, I think, complex when we think about how to navigate that in such a fast moving and in some ways such a nebulous space. You know what I mean? So the questions I heard you say is really about, thinking about crisis or untrue information getting out there, for example. And I think that's a great example of why some of the work matters so much. not just when the crisis hits and having a crisis team available, if you will. But I think that's where having that consistent process and consistent presence over time becomes more and more important. And that's something that I think we're all trying to get used to in our own ways. We need that visibility and proof of trust over time so that we are stronger as a topic, as an issue, as a business, as an agency, when some of those challenges do come up. You know what I mean?
You just put that beautifully about the value of communications, especially in a moment of crisis. It's being able to rest on your laurels in that case, right? Like everything that you've done up to that point, the foundation of trust that you've built up to that point really, really matters when those crises inevitably do happen. And on the last episode of this podcast that I did, we talked about something similar here, but I think sometimes there is just this, I don't know, this sort of underlying fear, like background fear that I mentioned of, and maybe this is just me having anxiety, I don't know, but I do think other communications professionals can relate, and other business leaders, but this underlying fear of what about when the crisis happens? Like, what am I going to do when the crisis happens? So just kind of hoping that never happens, and therefore not really taking steps to address that, especially in like a smaller company, right? And kind of viewing communications more as a cost center rather than, potentially an offense, like a way to get ahead of when something inevitably happens. So, I think that the way you described that actually was like totally perfect. I would love to hear from you, just like switching gears here a little bit. I really liked when we talked last time, the analogy that you made between, the slug versus the shell shot. And
yeah, absolutely.
How communication is, or how information is getting out there. So what are some of the changes? And you mentioned traditional media was kind of always the center of the information universe, right? Like that was what everyone was competing for. That was how we were communicating with the public. How much has that changed with the advent of new media? And why do you think it is so challenging for, could be a company, but could also be, a government body of some sort? What are the different changes you've seen that have made it so challenging to connect with publics or stakeholder groups?
Yeah, I think that's a really essential question, and where a lot of our work has been focused. And the way the media consumption and information consumption has changed has been really in a few different ways. You see differences by age. So, for example, people who get their news on television through print media tend to be a little bit older. Usually 55 and up is stronger versus online. There's also just a splintering of channels. So a lot of people are turning to social media more often, which is dictated by your algorithms in terms of how you get your information. And then you have your blogs, and not blogs, it's Substack now, kind of coming in behind that. And the thing that is so interesting about the way that's changing information, I think the analogy you've referred to that I shared when we talked earlier, is this idea of kind of a slug versus a shell shot. The idea of a slug is, if you're not familiar with hunting, it's a strong piece of lead that you would use if you're hunting for a deer. Whereas a shell shot is those little BBs in a shell casing. You'd use it for birds. And the idea is that, if you were to shoot a deer with a shell shot, it would just kind of graze it a little bit. It'd annoy it, but it wouldn't really get through. Whereas if you shot like a pheasant with a slug, it would not go well. And I think that's a little bit of where our information ecosystem has gotten to. And even our social connections and our social relationships have gotten to. We've gone from this place of having this one monolithic narrative, and a variety of groups might offer their own perspective on that narrative, to a variety of different smaller narratives and groups and identity. We no longer are guaranteed to have our community just by the geography that surrounds us. It's also probably related to where we work. It's related to how we identify. If you're, a parent, maybe a lot of your social connection is coming through your kids' sports and your kids' schools or your church, your associations, but they're not necessarily guaranteed to be geographic. And so what ends up happening as a net result is that we have these little fragments of information, and each of us have very different fragments of information. And then we get put into an algorithm ecosystem that reinforces that identity. And that makes it, I think, harder for us to build shared understanding and shared narrative around problems or issues. The other thing that stands out to me on that front, when I think about the work that I've been able to do just through our client work in recent years, as we've talked to people who can't get online, is their experience is just so fundamentally different. And I think it's easy to underestimate how much those individuals can't even get access to some of the basic information that we assume, whether it's online newspapers or text messages, because you don't have a phone plan that allows you to get your text messages consistently. And so the net effect of all of that is you have these variations by age in terms of where people are getting their information, but also by identity group. And then also for those that are left behind digitally, there's a whole nother kind of ecosystem of information around them. And I think it makes it really hard to build shared understanding. You know, there's a political scientist named Daniel Yankelovich. He used to have this, not used to, but it was more relevant in the 90s, this book called Coming to Public Judgment. And the idea was really about all of the steps and types of information necessary to build strong enough public understanding of a problem that you could have a policy solution. And if you just look at our information ecosystem from that lens, it's really hard to get enough of a shared narrative that we can do big things together. It's even just hard for topics to break through. There are just so many issues right now that don't break through to the majority to even know that they're going on, let alone to form their own opinion about what they want to see from it. You know what I mean? I think that's really hard. It's an opportunity, but it's also hard.
Yeah. It does sound hard as well, because when I hear you talk about, you know, the different channels that are available now to share information, and even look at us sitting here, doing a podcast interview, right, that I'm able to go and publish myself, from the perspective of being able to have different voices and different perspectives and different points of view out there. I think that sounds like a great thing and an exciting thing, right? In terms of like diversity of thought. So like in a way, it's a good thing. And those are some of the good examples of how new media and digital media makes that possible. But then to your point, the challenges are also great, with that sort of shared understanding of issues, right? Being able to kind of form that solid understanding that, hey, this is something we need to change. Like, for example, I don't know, wearing seatbelts or something, right? I think we can all agree wearing a seatbelt is a good thing, but it's getting harder and harder to do that, is, what I'm hearing you say. And I just would love to hear, because it's such a big challenge, right? And I understand there's a lot of nuance, and that's kind of what I was getting at, which is like, it's not a black and white thing. It's not like this is all good or this is all bad, right? But this is the environment that we have. So what can we do with it? How can we make it better, safer? And who dictates what's better and safer? So from your point of view and from your research and the work that you've done, what solutions are there for these challenges? How can we sort of preserve or maintain the good and try to scale down the bad?
Right. Yeah, I think that's kind of $1 million question right now, isn't it? So I think there's a lot of great things going on, like you mentioned with this podcast and with others, that people really leaning into the opportunity of having their own voice and building their own social connections, online connections. I just think that's such an opportunity. And I think it's something we've seen a lot of people do well and need to continue to do well. At the same time, I think we do have to also start thinking about where is too much. I would say personally, from my perspective, I've started to take the position or the lens of thinking about, do we need to look at public information as a public good. And by that, I mean both thinking about who can get online and who can't, because if we're moving all of our services online, but not allowing or having the regulations around us to ensure everyone can get online, we're cutting whole groups of people out from participating in public life. And then the other side of that coin I think about is, where do we have almost information pollution? So that being where we have too much or algorithms kind of overpowering topics. Is that an area where we need to start looking at algorithms and the type of information that people are fed and say, maybe there is some public good that comes from having some assurance that everyone is not only given information that directly feeds their algorithm and their worldview at all times. A little bit of the like, eat your veggies, if you will. So I don't have an exact solution of what those policies might look like, but I do look at it like when we had the Industrial Revolution, we had a lot of great growth and change to our economy, like what we have right now. But we also had a lot of health consequences from some smokestacks. And so we made a few changes to how those smokestacks functioned so that we could ensure the health of the public overall. And I do wonder if we need to kind of take that lens and thinking about our information space and say, what do we need to have as just a social foundation to say, we need to have information as a people to have democracy, to make decisions. And what are some of the guardrails or expectations we need to have of private companies who are doing business in that space so that we take down the temperature and we increase access to truth and factual information and in all of its strengths. So that to me is the ideal. And I think it's becoming even more important when we look at AI, because AI is just recycling what exists, and we don't exactly know what's in those algorithms or how it's reinforcing for people. But this idea that so much of everyone's information is really a reflection of your current connections and your current perspectives, I think sets us on a trajectory we've never been on before, and it might not be helpful for the whole.
On the AI topic, one of the things I know I had mentioned I wanted to talk to you about is the leadership of AI companies, some of the statements that they make. And I think that for the people listening to this podcast, it's from that communications professional perspective. So when we think about communicating with the stakeholder groups, and right, like a big part of this conversation has been about how there are so many and how it's getting increasingly difficult to engage all of them, and how you really do have to be strategic about how you're going to engage all of your stakeholder groups. You need to understand who they are. You need to understand where they are, because to your point, some of them could be offline. Like if you work for a company that is primarily serving older people, for example, they're probably not going to be on TikTok getting their information from your company, but and I know that's a generalization, but it's just really important to understand your stakeholder groups. And so I've been observing this, and I know other people have too, but I've been observing this sort of phenomenon, I guess, or this pattern where the CEOs of these AI companies are out there making statements that, are probably quite hyperbolic, but also that seem like very like antisocial, where it's like AI is going to replace all white collar jobs or all humanities jobs, and basically working as hard as they can to make that happen. So for me as a person, with a white collar job, I see that and I'm like, oh no, I really don't want that. And I know there's plenty of other people out there online, talking about that, or plenty of other, like media and journalists writing about this particular topic. But to me, it's pretty clear that it's because they're speaking to an investor audience, right? So like they're specifically looking at the people that are funneling money into their companies and saying, okay, how much can this grow? How much more can we do with this? Or even in the example of Palantir, right? Like one of Palantir's biggest customers is the US government. So of course, like who are they going to be talking to when they're out speaking publicly, but the US government, right? So our surveillance capabilities or things like that. So and I don't know, we don't have a crystal ball, right? Like we can't look into it and say what's going to happen, but what are some of the risks of ignoring many other stakeholder groups in favor of, one, because this is something I'm seeing where they're like doing a lot of this talking to investors, but they're not really focused on everybody else. And we're actually seeing like the public perception kind of like shifting negatively towards AI companies and obviously data centers and things like that. So is that something that you've observed? And what do you see as some of the risks of ignoring different publics, whether it's because they don't have access to the internet or because they're not the ones that are going to invest $1 billion into your company? You know what I mean? What are some of the risks?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. And it's an interesting calculus. Like, how are we defining risk? You know what I mean? Like if you're an Elon Musk or if you're a Palantir or something, do they only define risk as whether or not they get what they're after, whatever their new project is? Or do they consider social consequence a risk? Or do they consider kind of some of the long-term, past the metrics, past the quarter, do they consider that a risk? I think, when you think about the field of public policy and, sociology and public policy to me are kind of two sides of the same coin, because it's really how do we identify as groups and then how do we set guardrails as groups for the benefit of all. And the field of policy is really about being attentive to the needs of everyone, not just kind of the center of the curve, if you will. And it's really intentional in thinking about what are the unintended consequences of a choice. And not just how do we make the fastest choice, but how do we make choices in ways that give everyone an opportunity for their best life. That's a really different set of value proposition than just speaking to investors. And as a private business, there's a lot of private businesses that just speak to investors. That is not, I think, atypical. Where it becomes gray, especially with some of these technology companies, is their business is really, in many ways, infrastructure. And every other form of infrastructure that we have is a highly regulated environment. You look at what it takes to build a highway or a toll road. You take what it looks to build a power grid. It's different from state to state, but there is regulation around it. And this is really the governance has not caught up to the technology. But we are, I think, seeing these connection points or these rubs where the public good has to get on the ledger at some point. A private business is a private business because you can set your ledger of where your interest of business is. Things outside of that are not your concern. But when we start talking about something that's becoming so foundational to how people get information and move through the world, it's becoming infrastructure in a different way that I'm not sure our regulations have really caught up to. And so I don't know if there would be a consequence to them in just speaking to investors if that doesn't happen. But I think that's why it's important to really bring that into the conversation. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I love that framing because I've never thought of it like that as infrastructure, and that actually makes so much sense. And it also explains why when for me anyway, when I'm like seeing those comments being made and wondering why is there no like response to that, or what will the response to that be? Because it's one thing to say that because you're trying to get more people to invest in your company. But it's another thing to actually try to, enact that and implement that, and to a degree, like force that onto people that aren't asking for it, So I think you make a great point about the sort of regulatory landscape that exists for these other sort of infrastructure companies and looking at AI as part of that. And from an infrastructure perspective as well, the role that AI plays in disseminating information, not necessarily creating information, right? Because as you mentioned, it kind of pulls in this sort of like aggregated information from across the internet. But, it really is a powerful piece of infrastructure or
Totally.
tool or mechanism for, again, sharing information and people finding information. So it only makes sense that it's something that should probably be regulated, right? To make sure it is safe. to make sure for the public good that the information is accurate and correct and in the best interest of the public. So, to that point about information pollution that, we talked a bit about earlier, and, how there can be kind of I guess, a bit of a discomfort, right, in asking questions about, is this actually good for everyone? Is this actually right? I'm curious about what, it's just so hard because you don't have a crystal ball, right? But like, what could that process look like? How does that process start of like regulating these things or kind of reining in that information environment, whether it's AI or social media or any combination of these Wild West channels out there? What does that process look like of reining that in? Like, where do we start?
Yeah, I've put more thought into this than is probably typical. I will say some of the things I think about as being pivot points in this issue are a few. One, I go back to that Daschle Thune election I referenced from 2004 when they paid bloggers. And at that time, there was a lot of congressional watchdogs and kind of constitutional free speech watchdogs who raised some questions about election balance. So if you, for example, have political information that you're sharing on traditionally regulated communications channels, like Late Night with Colbert, I think has gotten in the crosshairs of this. There's actually laws on the books that say you have to be fair about covering both sides of a topic. Those existing regulations that we had to temper our political information environment for decades just haven't been translated to the internet. We've just kind of said they get a pass. When we think about how we regulate the infrastructure of things like broadband and cell phones, there's a long history of public utilities commissions, some of those types of bodies regulating telephone, regulating those communications channels, just for the assurance that it's available to everybody consistently. Those regulations have not been translated. As soon as we moved our phones off of the walls and the wires that way into cell towers, the regulations just haven't translated. And so we do actually have a long history of taking some of these steps around broadcast media, around traditional phone communication, other types of communication. We just haven't taken this step to translate it to the online world. And where I think it becomes concerning from my perspective, back to those different stakeholder groups, I think as long as we don't have a way of understanding what our shared problems are as a community, as a society, it becomes harder to say these are what we need to do to create opportunity for everybody, not in a partisan way, but just in a, here's how we reset the foundations of who we are as a society, and we'll have different disagreements about what we want to be the right business or what we want to be the right topic, whatever it is. But resetting that infrastructure becomes harder to do when people can't see it.
No, it makes a ton of sense. And, I'm not a political expert, certainly, or anything of that nature, but it just seems like common sense to, like you said, translate those regulations to, or that framework to digital media, whether it's social media or AI or, these really powerful sources of information, so that, we don't have as much of the information pollution, or we can start to get a hold on that. And I think from the comms professional perspective, you could look at these things and say, like, where do I even start? How do I even begin to address this? How is this going to affect my work moving forward? How is it already affecting my work? As far as, and again, these are people who are not making policy decisions, right? These are not people who can say, oh yes, well, we need to apply this, and this law. It's just people who are in their day-to-day, trying to connect with their customers, yes, connect with their local communities, connect with investors, connect with employees, right? Partners, all these different groups of people that have different information needs and different methods of interacting with these companies, with these brands. What are some of the actions that we should be taking now to protect ourselves from information pollution to the degree that we can? And from your work, right? So two-part question here, protecting from information pollution, but also based on your work and, how you've helped organizations through, significant changes. What's some advice that you have for communications professionals in this current environment for how they can better connect with their stakeholder groups and just do a better job of communications overall in this really challenging environment?
I think that's such an important question. And when I think about just how we do our work, brass tacks, it always starts with really detailed stakeholder mapping, thinking about who's the universe of stakeholders and where do they fit kind of in that customer journey. So I know that's just a good step one, but I think it becomes 10 times more important in this environment. And then being really intentional after that and thinking about where those different groups get their information. I think those two steps are always where we start any engagement, whether we're doing research or we're doing change projects. And I think it's just a good practice overall. The other thing I think about in terms of communications that I try to be attentive to and would encourage others to think about is I think because we don't have the media setting that overall narrative the way we used to, there is actually a real opportunity. I think especially brands are well positioned to step into this, where we can set our own narrative of what's the future we seek and what's the story that we're trying to tell, not just in those day-to-day, like what's the headline, what's the clickbait, but really thinking long-term about where, if it's a business, if it's an association, if it's a long-term change, where we're trying to go and what are the chapters of that story, who needs to come with us on that journey. I think in a way it becomes very empowering if you can think about things that way. And so that would be, I think, the biggest piece of advice is being really deliberate about some of those things. And then I would argue relationships just become all the more important in this environment, whether it's those online relationships and how you're showing up day to day, not just blasting about yourself, but engaging with others. But then also just thinking about how that translates into your offline relationships and your offline strategy. You can't deep fake lunch, you know what I mean? And sometimes being really strategic about those things becomes all the more important when we're faced with so much. It's just almost pollution that you can't tell what's true and what's not. You know what I mean? So those are a few things I think about.
And it's excellent advice that you're giving. And, again, I think just reinforces again the value and importance of communications as a function in any organization, public or private. And that, yes, there's a lot of challenges, as we were just discussing at length, right? But to your point, there are also opportunities. There are also benefits. And I think if there was ever a time to really think deeply about who your stakeholders are and what they need from you and how you can build that connection, build that trust, build that relationship, now is the time to do it. Actually, probably yesterday was the time to do it, right?
Yes.
But if not yesterday, then now will suffice, right? So there is optimism in this. There is hope in this. And, again, not look into a crystal ball, but just if we look historically, right, at some point, the policy, the regulations should catch up to this moment that we're in, right? But yeah, fingers crossed, with the assumption that that will happen at some point. For now, all we can focus on is the things that we can control, and the things that we can control is how we choose to engage with our stakeholders and understand our stakeholders and build relationships with our stakeholders. So it's just has been such an amazing conversation. And I want to ask Stephanie if there's anything else that you want to share with our listeners, any final bit of wisdom or advice that you would impart on listeners of Good Marketing with Stephanie.
Well, first, I want to applaud you for taking on this topic. I think it's so important to be thinking about those social connections and really it's so foundational to everything we do. The other thing I think of just listening to your final comments is I think as long as I've been in this, I don't work in politics, but I would say government adjacent space, I always tell folks to really think about that serenity prayer of just, control what you can and let go of what you can't. And I feel like that every year gets more and more resonant with how we have to navigate this space. So appreciate the way you brought that up. So thank you very much for having me. Appreciate the conversation.
Yeah, it's been absolutely awesome. And that's why I wanted to have your perspective on here, right? As a sociologist, as someone who has studied this, who's researched these topics, who deeply understands that connection between media and information and, society, essentially, right? I really wanted to hear your perspective on these topics because as a communications and PR professional myself, right, I also have an online life, right? I have algorithms that serve content to me, and sometimes the content is scary. And sometimes, to your point, you said this earlier, it's hard to tell what's true and what's not, to evaluate how serious is this threat to my job or my life or whatever, right? And anybody who's online is like really subject to those algorithms. And, I think it is important to take a step back and understand, yes, that this environment has not been regulated at all. So there is not any single source of truth for anything. That, yes, traditional media is maybe no longer that source of truth for everything. And that we're in a, not that this is news to anyone, but this is a fast changing and evolving situation and scenario that we're in that, I'm sure you would agree. And I think you did point to this earlier, that this is a new frontier for us. So for the rest of us as, professionals and as people, we're just responding to that in the best way that we can. Yes, focusing on what we can control is the best way to address it, right? So yeah, it's been so fun having you on. Such great insights coming out of this conversation. So can you tell us, Stephanie, where friends of Good Marketing with Stephanie can find you on social media?
The place where I'm active is on LinkedIn. So I think it's just LinkedIn/Stephanie Devitt or SDK Strategic Services. So
excellent. And I also recommend heading to Stephanie's website, which is sdkstrategicservices.com, to learn more about the fantastic work that she is doing. And I highly recommend that you follow her on social media as well. We'll make sure we include links in the show notes for you. But thank you again for joining me today, Stephanie, and diving deep into this topic that I think is a little bit uncomfortable for people in the comms and PR field, but is an absolutely necessary thing for us to talk about. So for our listeners, until next time, if you learned something new today, or you heard an idea or a perspective that lit a spark for you, please do subscribe, rate, and share the Good Marketing with Stephanie podcast. And to you, Stephanie Devitt, thank you again for being on the show. It was wonderful having you.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Really appreciate the opportunity.
All right, and until next time, that's been Good Marketing with Stephanie.